Uh, well, I'll just start by saying I'm really glad to see so many familiar faces. I'm not very sure if it makes my job easier or more difficult, because you probably already know most of the things that I'm going to talk about, but I hope there'll be something new that we could discuss. What I want to talk about today is the idea of actually understanding type design in a wider context and looking at it in a way that sort of opens up the field. As we see type design progress into, go into different scripts, people are designing newer scripts, more scripts every year, and more explorations happen. The markets are actually getting larger. What we're seeing is we're probably getting lesser and lesser time to be really interested in what we're doing, because there is so little time to be engaged with, say, the design of the script, that you almost assume a lot of ideas that either the education framework provides or the professional practice provides. So this is quite an interesting stage to be in, and it's possibly one of the more interesting challenges today to look at these contexts, to see what we can derive from these contexts, and to see how these challenges can be handled. I'm very glad that Hera talked about the movement of people, and we didn't plan this. It's a total accident. But yes, it's map morning, so there's going to be a bit more of this. What I'm talking about is global practice, as we understand it today, is not something particularly new. So we've seen everything that's happened in many countries related to printing, related to typography, type design, has started in an international manner. There's never been a sort of insularity about these things, which a lot of arguments are being made for today. If we look at the arrival of the printing press, it arrived in India in 1556, totally as an accident. It was supposed to be going to Ethiopia, but they decided not to because of political changes in Ethiopia. Of course, they didn't take this route over land. They of course had to, go around the African coast. But this is just representation. So what we see is a sort of a new technology arriving again quite predictably at the coastal areas and sort of penetrating deeper inland slowly over a period of time. But it's interesting to see how much of this internationalization was already in motion. So, for instance, here you can see the Danish missionaries had a base in the south of India where they established a printing press. And, of course, given the paucity of material to do anything with type founding, type designing, the story goes that they actually made type out of the covers of Cheshire cheese lead boxes. So, all kinds of things. All kinds of innovations were happening in a very hands-on manner. And the same missionaries sort of moved up further and a lot of, it became a sort of a base in the sort of the eastern part of India, where Serampur became one of the centers of printing of multiple languages. So a lot of languages and scripts were actually made for the first time, not only for the Indian subcontinent, but also for China, also for Tibet, also for Armenian scripts. So we see that there is a whole lot of different motivation going behind all these different activities. If we look at the colonial history, the British established bases in both Calcutta and Bombay, and they sort of functioned as major areas of printing activity in the country and continue to do so beyond just the time that it was established. The same could be said for the French, who had a base in the south, and the first English press, in fact, was captured from the French. But I think the most significant and surprisingly significant influence on type and typography came from American missionaries who established a base in Bombay in the early 1800s. And they continued to sort of to make new advances in type design. So, for instance, the first time that letters, metal letters, were actually divided up into parts and made up into more manageable ways of dealing with large amounts of text. That came from the press that the American Mission Press and its foundry sort of started. So that's interesting because it's just to give you an idea of how international this whole idea was. It was not just a matter of people from the West, but also the paper for the printing came from China, came from the Middle East. So printing has generally been quite an international activity. And if we look at the global practice in 20th century, it's interesting to note how these motivations behind developing new things came about. So, for instance, early 20th century, we have a sort of a surge of interest in mechanical typesetting and faster ways of production. And this came from centers in Bombay where, basically, because of the sort of rising political awareness against the colonial oppression, started to push more and more indigenous newspaper owners to look for faster and easier methods of getting print out to people. And which is where one of the first developments seem to have, this history is not particularly well documented at all, and this might be of interest to some of you. One of the earliest attempts that were made to get an Indian script into mechanical typesetting systems was started early in 1920s, and by people in Bombay who contacted the Monotype Corporation to develop something. And it's quite an interesting history, which is also my topic of research, where you see that there are multiple sort of layers of development which we don't exactly know. We know that companies like Monotype and Linotype produced a single typeface, but actually that isn't exactly true. There's a whole layer of development, and mostly the history of the process is far more interesting than the history of the product itself, because it's much easier to sort of categorize that as a single object, which a typeface is usually. It's very difficult to classify a typeface as a single object, because the mutations that it goes through are actually quite interesting in themselves to sort of define the notion of type. The same thing happened far out in the West in New York, where in the 1930s, the Linotype company, the Morgenthau Linotype company, took an interest in developing a Devanagari Linotype. What they looked for was, they derived their inspiration from a local press, the Nirnay Sagar press, which was already famous and subsequently became quite the basis of a lot of designs in Devanagari and Gujarati. But it's interesting to note that these, the people who started the Nirnay Sagar press were also sort of connected. They worked at the American Mission Press earlier, and they established their own afterwards. So you can see that there's a sort of chain of relations between all of these developments. And once the machine was developed, it went to London, and from there traveled to Calcutta in 1933, where in September it was demonstrated for the first time. A similar story can be told for a composition, in fact. So something that developed as a collaborative effort in MIT between a printer in Pune and a printer and IIT Corporation in MIT, based in drawing on the work of Sam Caldwell and Louis Rosenblum. So later on, when for a composition actually materialized for a Devanagari typeface, it's interesting that the commission to Matthew Carter, who designed it, came from England, and which again derived from the inspiration of the typefaces of the Nirnay Sagar press. The digitization and the processing was done in Germany, and the testing was again it was sent to India, and sent back to England. So there's a constant loop of connections here, which sort of point to the idea that not just the development of typefaces is not just about formal manipulations. Because as we go on into a world where we understand globalization as multiple scripts, more things need to be done. I think the thing that we're kind of getting to in the practice of type designing is that we think that it is merely about putting things, making things look like each other, for instance. That's one of the basic policies that you could kind of be subject to. But one of the interesting aspects of this kind of an approach is that you have to understand what kind of context are we looking at. Are we looking at the context and deriving something that's meaningful to the practice, or is this actually reinforcing certain ideas which may or may not be particularly useful, both in theoretical frameworks and everyday practice? So, for instance, if you look at this, a certain depiction of writing in India, it's interesting to see what people thought was, the manner of writing or the practice of writing. So you can actually see one of the most interesting things is they've got hyphens down there somewhere, which is really kind of interesting. It's a very sort of typographic notion, really. And of course, the boards are huge. I mean, this is actually one of the most. This is not a kind of example that you would easily find. A large lettering in actually any Indian script. It's very often something of this nature, which is the sort of classical idea of what text looks like, and why it looks like this is actually quite an interesting thing in itself. So, one of the theories is that why you've got the landscape format, why you've got a dense, long line of text, isn't it more difficult to read a longer line of text? One of the theories is, of course, that the practice of writing isn't exactly serving the same purpose as you would think other writing does. Most of these texts are usually religious texts. So when the writer actually comes to this document, he already knows the text. He's already familiar with the text. So one of the theories is that because it's not really a sort of record keeping, it's mainly something that gives you a cue when you need it, but mainly because it's coming from an oral culture, or your text is mainly in your memory, you come to it as a different kind of a reader, and you come to it as a different kind of writer. So, the other interesting thing about it is, of course, the format of the book itself, the landscape format, which is usually deriving from the practice of using, birch bark in the northern parts of India and palm leaves in the southern part of India, where writing was really done on longer leaves. The sort of format was derived from the material, the substrate itself. And if you look at the writing practice, the sort of traditional writing style, you get something like that. So you've got a metal stylus, and the substrate is moved. You can see those the sort of palm leaves in the scribe's hand. And this is interesting because when you have different influences coming together and different material, different technologies entering into the domain, you see how things kind of evolve, and things kind of evolve into a newer aspect. So this is again sort of a century later or so. But if you compare the two writers there, they're really pretty much the same. What has changed are actually the tools. Now there is sort of paper, there's a sort of a proper pen and a codex book. And it's interesting to see how a simple idea like the codex form of the book gets transformed, gets changed according to its use. So really, what we were talking about in the international framework, the things that come off as, what is really the understanding of technology is quite an interesting aspect, because if you think of the models which we're talking about, it seems to have a sort of a diffusionist idea behind it. The fact that technology starts someplace and kind of goes everywhere else, and the remoter the area is, the longer it takes to get there. So it's a bit like William Gibson's idea of the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. But that's a certain kind of a model. Whereas if you look at the actual use, it tells you a lot more about technology and its persistence and its parallels between previous practices and future practices which are yet to come. So if you look at this example, for instance, I mean, this is a wholly unheard of use, one would say, of the codex format, because it looks very comfortable though. He's got his arm on one side of the thing, and it's a street banker, so it's not something that is sort of esoteric, but this is street practice, everyday work, which sort of defines what kind of a format, what kind of what kind of use can be made of a similar object. The same tool can be sort of transformed into a whole new purpose. So we see something like that deriving and carrying on into other practices shaped by the text itself. So if you've got lists, the purpose of the text in the landscape format book has totally changed. It kind of doesn't have the same sense of practicality to have a longitudinal format and then kind of have lists very easily. Whereas you can see that this is a sort of fair adaptation of the same form. It is a long horizontal book, but it's really being read upside down, vertically. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that there is an idea. If there is an essence of culture, it has to be polyphonic. It's not something that is a very fixed idea of something works because it is traditional, for instance, and as if it would not evolve into something new. A similar kind of situation is something that we find ourselves in when we're designing typefaces. Now, there's one side of the argument is that there is a conventional idea of what works and what is the correct way of doing things, and then there is the other idea of sort of putting things together into newer forms. Now there isn't exactly a conflict. That is the whole point. That I think what we're trying to make into a conflict is actually quite a natural process. Older things and newer ideas come together and form and continue into something which is possibly practically more beneficial or better informed, really. So this is really the point of showing you these bits, because without the idea of actually knowing how or why what kind of context we are setting our work in, it's very difficult to make these decisions. And purely based on formal logic, it is not enough. Formal logic isn't exactly sufficient by itself to give you enough guidance to do things. So this used to be a bit of a sort of self-explanatory argument 10 years back, but it's really interesting how things have evolved, because designers usually are very happy to be shown anything in a diagrammatic form. It seems half the convincing is done if there is a diagram. And you can see, well, don't take it badly, but the thing is, you can see here the idea that there is something that's evolving from, there is a certain process behind it, and there's something that's evolving from a traditional form into something which is perhaps more modern, perhaps more, in keeping with the times. Now, what's interesting is not to say whether this is a good or bad approach. I mean, that's not interesting. What is interesting is how does this really work, and why is a certain model chosen, why not another, and why is the result better or worse than the original idea, for instance. So if you look at the form on your left there, that's a very specific form to take, and then it sort of simplifies the idea of further simplification, because if you were to take a more complicated form, the transformation would be a little more radical, and it wouldn't particularly give you this sort of smooth transition, sort of logical, rational idea. Now, this I think is the limitation behind any sort of formal experimentation. It's great to do that, but you have to understand letters in context. Letters outside of their textual context mean nothing. And much as we could kind of try sort of enjoying design, I don't think it really makes very much sense. If it doesn't have purpose, then it is something else. So as a formal exercise, this is quite interesting. And as I said, the question is not to say if this is a great idea or if this is good or bad. The question to ask here really is, does this approach take into account the context where this letter is going to be read? Can you actually decipher this letter is one of the first obvious questions. And I mean, it is quite clear that quite radical things are happening in the top bits there and the bits here. There's clearly a certain sense of modularity about it. You could kind of equate it with the early Bauhaus attempt at a universal typeface. So there are quite interesting things happening here, and there are directions that kind of could be explored further. But I think the problem happens when you see this as a designer, when you're looking at things, you see these things only as binary opposites, only as either good model or a bad model to follow. It is not really just this classification of good or bad, but you have to sort of look if there is any possibility of analyzing and gaining more information than the answer that it is a good model to follow. So quickly running into it, I mean, one of the most fascinating things about typographic history is how it steers really clear away from larger histories, so political awareness or political history. Whereas if you look at most of the development of typefaces, they have a very strong political motivation behind them and a political will behind them. So as we saw, the whole idea of printing serving a certain purpose came from a political idea of territorial expansion, for instance. And the same thing you see here as a counter to that idea, where script reforms, which were quite a feature in India and quite a lot of other parts of the world, it's sort of a countermeasure to sort of gain control over script, not just politically, but also formally. And you can see that again, these are formal experiments which sort of go away from considering one of the crucial issues of their context, which is text and typography. Type doesn't exist just purely by itself, but it needs to be considered in the typographic context. Well, this image is interesting. I just wanted to show you this because this is part of my research, but it shows you the juxtaposition of how modern typography, or rather modern technology, modern machinery, the ideas of modernization come into force in a very different way. With pure, traditional paraphernalia, you've got, the way of respecting the tools that you work with, which is a very traditional Indian way of doing things. But at the same time, this is this heavy machinery there. So you've got interesting juxtapositions, and there is something to be derived from this. And well, I'll not dwell on this. I think I'm running out of time. But you see that formal experiments are not just based on the designer's will, but also dictated by technology have been dictated by technology for a very long time. And you see that people who've kind of grown up on certain kinds of things, certain kinds of text, certain kinds of patterns, and certain kinds of looking at dealing with documents, are totally kind of programmed in a sense to look at documents, not irrespective of whether they were good solutions or bad solutions, or whether there were limitations to something, or whether there is a better way to do it. So the question to be asked really is, what kind of documents are we looking at? Are we actually thinking, when we're designing type, are we thinking of documents at all? Or are we just trying to, in a way, sort of out of the context, basically looking at forms and not really looking at very much else? Or how typography is going to evolve is not our concern. I mean, that's one of the things that is very clear in a lot of type design today in Indian scripts. So if you see, there's a lot of good type design work happening, but the typography is really not going anywhere. The people who use the type that people design are just not there. There's mainly no model outside, say, the traditional form, which is something like that, or something like that. You know, there is not very much typographic exploration here. We could do type explorations, but they really need to be sitting in a context which is typographic. So with that, I think I'll stop there with the quote, which says, "Trade is a big influence in getting people to take an interest in one another, but so is the sheer pursuit of human curiosity." What we really need is more interest, more experimentation, but more generally well-informed ideas of type design. So with that, I thank you for your patience.